A 76-year-old lady begins to feel inexplicable pains in her head, as if something invisible were hurting her from within. While her family ignores her suffering, a young maid makes a shocking discovery on her scalp, and what seemed like mere age-related delusion turns into a terrifying truth no one was prepared to face. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The morning light streamed through the bedroom window, illuminating Mrs. Eleanor's tired face as she tried to find some relief from the pain she was feeling. At 76 years old, this woman with snow-white hair and still dignified posture, despite a spine slightly curved by the weight of the years, had never complained so much. She had always been strong, survived so many silent battles throughout her life, raised her son alone after her husband left her, worked hard as a seamstress in the Camden Town district of London, and never asked anyone for help. But now, something was different. The pain in her head wasn't like common aches that came and went. It was a strange sensation, as if small electric shocks ran through her skull from inside out, tiny stabs that came without warning, leaving her dizzy and confused. She brought her hand to her scalp, trying to massage the area where the pain was most intense, but each touch only made the situation worse. A sharp burning, as if someone were pricking needles into her skin, made her pull her hand away quickly. Mrs. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror of the antique wardrobe that held so many memories. Her reflection showed a woman who still maintained her dignity, but her eyes revealed something new, something she didn't want to admit: fear. For the first time in many years, she felt afraid of what was happening to her own body. The house where she lived with her son, Robert, was a simple two-story house in the Notting Hill neighborhood, with faded yellow walls and wooden windows that creaked when the wind blew strong. It was the same place where she had raised Robert, where every corner held memories of a lifetime. But since Isabella arrived, everything had changed. Isabella was Robert's wife, a tall, elegant woman with straight, black hair that fell perfectly over her shoulders. She came from a middle-class family from Kensington and always made it clear, through glances and subtle comments, that she considered that house and that neighborhood beneath her standards. Since the day she moved there 6 months ago, the family atmosphere had transformed. The laughter that once filled the dining room disappeared. Sunday lunches, which used to gather neighbors and friends, no longer happened. Mrs. Eleanor's warm presence, who always welcomed everyone with a smile and fresh coffee, now seemed to bother her. Mrs. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, holding onto the wooden handrail. Each step seemed harder than the last, not only due to physical tiredness but also to the emotional weight she carried. The pain in her head pulsed more intensely with each movement, and she had to stop halfway to catch her breath. That's when she heard Isabella's voice coming from the kitchen. "Isabella, you need to understand that this house has its rules," Robert was saying in a conciliatory tone. Mrs. Eleanor recognized that tone. It was the same one he used when trying to avoid conflicts, always seeking to maintain peace, even if it meant giving in on important points. "Rules, Robert?" Isabella's voice sounded cold and calculated. "Your mother acts as if this is still just her house. I am your wife, I live here too, and I have the right to make some changes. Those old furniture pieces in the living room are horrible, and don't even get me started on these floral curtains. This place looks like a house from the 50s. Mrs. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest. That furniture had been bought with so much sacrifice, each piece chosen with care. The curtains were sewn by her own hands, weeks of work she had done with love to make the house more beautiful. "Mum loves these things," Robert replied, but his voice was already weaker, lacking conviction. "Maybe we can talk to her about some small changes." "Small changes won't solve it, Robert. The problem is bigger than that." Mrs. Eleanor didn't want to hear more. She continued down the stairs, making sure to step harder on the last few steps to announce her presence. When she entered the kitchen, Isabella was standing by the stove, arms crossed, and Robert was sitting at the table with a half-empty cup of coffee. The silence that settled was heavy and uncomfortable. "Good morning," Mrs. Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good morning, Mrs. Eleanor," Isabella replied, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Coffee's ready, if you'd like to help yourself." "Thank you, dear." Mrs. Eleanor poured herself coffee into an old mug she had used for years, feeling Isabella's gaze on her. She knew her daughter-in-law considered those utensils old-fashioned, but for her, every object in that kitchen had sentimental value. She sat at the table next to Robert, who kissed her cheek. "How are you feeling today, Mum?" "The headache continues, my son. It's even worse than yesterday." Isabella turned quickly, as if that comment had captured her attention in a special way. "Still with that pain, Mrs. Eleanor. You know, people your age often have these problems. It might just be your body asking for rest, or maybe something related to blood pressure. Have you been taking your medication properly?" "I take everything correctly, Isabella. But this pain is different. It's like something is hurting me from inside." Isabella approached, and for the first time in weeks she seemed to show some genuine interest. "Let me see," she said, positioning herself behind Mrs. Eleanor. "Did you hit your head somewhere? Did you trip and fall?" "No, I didn't fall anywhere." Isabella's hands lightly touched Mrs. Eleanor's hair, and the elderly woman felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something about the way her daughter-in-law touched her hair that made her uncomfortable. Isabella's fingers ran over her scalp with calculated movements, as if searching for something specific. "I don't see anything wrong here, Mrs. Eleanor. Maybe it's just old age. Mental confusion, you know how it is. My grandmother had these problems too before she—" Isabella stopped abruptly, but the message was clear. Mrs. Eleanor felt the insinuation like a blow. She wasn't confused. She knew very well what she was feeling, and that pain was real. "I think you should book an appointment with the doctor, Mum," Robert suggested, sensing the discomfort in the air. "I will, my son." The rest of breakfast passed in tense silence. Mrs. Eleanor barely managed to eat the buttered bread Robert had prepared for her. The pain in her head seemed to pulse in sync with her heartbeat, and that conversation had only worsened her emotional state. After breakfast, Robert left for work at the car repair shop he managed in the neighboring district. Isabella retreated to her room, leaving Mrs. Eleanor alone in the living room. The elderly woman sat in her favorite armchair, the floral fabric one that Isabella criticized so much, and closed her eyes. Tears came without her being able to control them. They weren't just tears of physical pain, but of a deep loneliness that had settled in her heart since Isabella arrived. She remembered when Robert first introduced her to his girlfriend. Isabella had been polite, even friendly at that first meeting. But soon after the marriage, everything changed. The visits they made together became rare, then non-existent. Robert's phone calls, once daily, became weekly. And when the couple finally decided to live with her, Mrs. Eleanor thought it would be a new chance to build a relationship with her daughter-in-law and have the family reunited again. But what she found was an even greater distance, a coldness that chilled the atmosphere. The doorbell rang, pulling Mrs. Eleanor from her thoughts. She got up with difficulty and went to the door. On the other side was a young woman she didn't know, light-skinned, with curly hair tied in a ponytail and a gentle smile on her face. "Good morning, are you Mrs. Eleanor?" "Yes, dear, I am. Can I help you?" "My name is Julia. Mrs. Isabella hired me to help with the housework. She asked me to come today to start." Mrs. Eleanor felt a mix of surprise and annoyance. Isabella hadn't mentioned anything about hiring someone. For years, she herself had taken care of that house, and although she knew that age was making some tasks more difficult, she still felt capable of keeping everything in order. "Come in, dear. Isabella is in her room." Julia entered carrying a small backpack. She was around 25 years old and wore simple but clean clothes. There was something in her eyes, a natural kindness that immediately caught Mrs. Eleanor's attention. "Are you all right? You look a little pale," Julia commented with genuine concern. "I have a terrible headache, dear, but it will pass." Julia frowned, showing empathy. "My grandmother also suffered a lot from headaches. I used to massage her. If you like, I can try to help later." "You are very kind, thank you." Isabella came down the stairs at that moment, already dressed to go out. "Oh, Julia, good you arrived. I'm going out to sort some things. Mrs. Eleanor can show you where the cleaning products are. I want you to start with the kitchen and then the living room." Isabella grabbed her purse and left without saying goodbye, leaving Julia and Mrs. Eleanor alone. The young woman looked at the elderly lady with a sympathetic smile, as if she understood much more than had been said. Mrs. Eleanor showed Julia where the cleaning supplies were kept, a small cupboard at the back of the kitchen, as the young woman began to organize the products. The elderly lady observed her careful movements and her attention to detail. There was something familiar about this girl, a delicacy that reminded her of better times. "You don't need to stay standing with me, Mrs. Eleanor. Please go rest. I know what to do," Julia said gently. "You remind me of my mother, you know," Mrs. Eleanor commented, surprising herself with her own sincerity. She was like that too, thoughtful with everyone. Julia smiled, a sad and sweet smile at the same time. "My grandmother was everything to me. She raised me when my mother had to work in another city. I learned a lot from her, especially how to care for people with affection. Your grandmother must have been a special woman." "She was. She passed away 2 years ago, but I carry her teachings with me." Mrs. Eleanor felt an immediate connection with that young woman. For the first time in months, she felt there was someone in that house who truly cared, even though she was practically a stranger. "Julia, you said your grandmother had headaches. What were those pains like?" The young woman stopped what she was doing and looked at Mrs. Eleanor attentively. She complained of sharp pains as if someone was pricking needles in her head. It started suddenly, for no apparent reason. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong. "And what happened in the end?" Julia hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "In her case, we discovered it was something we never imagined, but everything was resolved when we found the true cause." "What was it?" The young woman looked around, as if to make sure they were really alone. "Mrs. Eleanor, may I ask you a question? Do you trust the people who live here with you?" The question caught the elderly woman by surprise. She opened her mouth to answer yes, that she trusted her son completely, but the words didn't come out. "And what about Isabella? Did she trust her?" "My son is a good man, Julia. He truly loves me." "And his wife?" Mrs. Eleanor lowered her eyes, unable to lie. "Isabella is complicated. She doesn't like me, that's clear, but to think she would do something to hurt me." "Would you allow me to examine your head? I learned some things when I took care of my grandmother." Mrs. Eleanor nodded, feeling a strange hope grow in her chest. Julia asked her to sit in a kitchen chair and began to carefully examine her scalp. Her fingers were soft, completely different from Isabella's cold touch that morning. "The light isn't good here. Do you have a magnifying glass at home?" "Yes, in my bedroom. I use it for sewing." Julia accompanied Mrs. Eleanor to the bedroom, a simple but cozy space, with an old sewing machine in a corner and photographs of Robert at various stages of his life scattered on the walls. The young woman took the magnifying glass. The elderly lady offered her and asked her to sit near the window, where the natural light was better. For several minutes, Julia methodically examined Mrs. Eleanor's scalp, gently separating the white strands. Suddenly, her fingers stopped at a specific spot on the back of her head. "Don't move, Mrs. Eleanor. I need to look at something here more closely." The young woman brought the magnifying glass closer and remained silent for a few seconds that seemed eternal. When she finally spoke, her voice was laden with concern. "Mrs. Eleanor, do you feel pain when I touch here?" Julia lightly pressed a spot, and the elderly woman felt a sharp pang. "Ouch! Yes, it hurts a lot." "I need you to trust me now. What I'm about to say might seem strange, but it's very serious. There's something buried in your head, something that shouldn't be there." Mrs. Eleanor's heart pounded. "What do you mean, dear? What are you saying?" "It seems to be a small piece of metal. I can only see it because it's starting to get inflamed around it. That's why you're feeling these pains." "But how? I didn't hurt myself. I didn't bump into anything." Julia took a deep breath before continuing. "In my grandmother's case, we found something similar. They were small metal staples that someone had put in her hair, but buried in her scalp, not just clipped to the hair. The person did it on purpose, pretending to be styling her hair, but actually hurting her." Mrs. Eleanor felt the world spin. She brought her hand to her chest, trying to control her accelerated breathing. Images began to surface in her mind, recent memories she hadn't paid attention to at the time. "Isabella," Mrs. Eleanor remembered aloud, "she's been touching my hair lately. Says it's messy, that it needs combing. I thought it was strange because she'd never done that before, but I thought she was trying to be kind." "When was the last time?" "Last night. She insisted on combing my hair before I went to sleep, said it had knots, that it needed tidying. I let her, thinking it was a gesture of affection. Julia held Mrs. Eleanor's hands firmly. Look, I could be wrong. It might have a different explanation, but I need to remove this object to relieve your pain, and we need to find out if there are more. Will it hurt much to take out? I'll do it very carefully. I have tweezers here in my backpack. I always carry them because I use them for eyebrows. I'll disinfect everything properly. Julia went to get her backpack and returned with a small toiletry bag. From inside, she took out thin tweezers, a bottle of alcohol and cotton. With precise movements, she disinfected the tweezers and began to work on Mrs. Eleanor's head. You'll feel a pull, but it will pass quickly. Mrs. Eleanor closed her eyes and gripped the arms of the chair. She felt the tweezers touch her scalp, then pressure, and finally a sharp pain that made her let out a groan. But immediately afterward came an immense relief, as if a weight had been removed. There, I've taken it out. Look at this. Julia showed the tweezers to Mrs. Eleanor. Clamped between the metal tips was a small staple, the kind used in office staplers, but it was rusty and had sharp points. My God, the elderly woman murmured, bringing her trembling hand to her mouth. How did that get there? I need to keep examining. If there's one, there might be more. For the next half hour, Julia continued her meticulous search, and to Mrs. Eleanor's horror, she found 3 more similar staples, all strategically placed at different points on the scalp, always hidden beneath the mass of white hair. Each time Julia removed a staple, Mrs. Eleanor felt a momentary relief from the pain, but also a growing sense of terror. Someone had done that to her intentionally, someone who had close access, who had gained her trust enough to touch her hair. Isabella, the name echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. But why? What would she gain by making her mother-in-law suffer that way? Mrs. Eleanor, the young woman interrupted her thoughts, I've removed all that I could find for now. You need to wash these areas well with antibacterial soap and water, and you have to watch for new symptoms. Julia, what do I do now? If I tell Robert, will he believe me? Isabella might say I'm making things up, that I'm confused because of my age. The young woman thought for a moment, then took her phone from her pocket. I'll take photos of the staples and the marks on your head. This is proof. And I think we need to be vigilant. If Isabella is really doing this, she'll try again. But why, my dear? Why would anyone do such a thing? Julia shook her head, her expression grim. In my grandmother's case, we discovered that the person wanted her to appear to have mental problems. They wanted to have her institutionalized, to take her house. The constant pains made my grandmother confused, irritated. People started to think she was losing her lucidity. Mrs. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The house. That house was worth a good sum. It was in a neighborhood that was appreciating in value. And Isabella had always made clear her desire to sell and buy an apartment in Kensington. The following days were ones of constant vigilance. Julia spent mornings and afternoons at the house, always attentive to Isabella's movements. Following the young woman's advice, Mrs. Eleanor began to gently refuse when her daughter-in-law offered to comb her hair, inventing excuses about scalp sensitivity or a preference for leaving her hair loose. Isabella showed no open suspicion, but her behavior had subtly changed. Her eyes often followed Julia, especially when the maid was near Mrs. Eleanor. The usual coldness gave way to an almost palpable tension. On a Thursday afternoon, Robert arrived home early from the workshop. He had a tired smile on his face and motor oil on his hands. Mrs. Eleanor's heart ached at the sight of him, her only son, the man she had raised with so much sacrifice. How could she tell him what she was discovering about his own wife? "Hi, Mum. How's the headache? Better?" "Much better, my son," she replied. And it wasn't a lie. Since Julia had removed the staples, the pain had significantly decreased. "That's good. Isabella told me you were very ill. I was worried." "It was just a passing discomfort." Robert hugged his mother with genuine affection, and Mrs. Eleanor felt tears threaten to well up. He didn't deserve to be in the middle of that situation, but she knew that soon she would need to confront him with the truth. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Mrs. Eleanor heard footsteps in the hallway. Through the crack under the door, she saw the hallway light turn on. Curious, and with a bad feeling, she silently got up and slightly opened her bedroom door. Isabella was standing in front of Julia's room, which was in a small back room of the house. Her daughter-in-law had something in her hand, but Mrs. Eleanor couldn't see what it was. For several minutes, Isabella remained there, motionless, just observing the closed door. Mrs. Eleanor felt her heart race. There was something deeply disturbing about that scene, in the way Isabella studied that door, as if planning something. Finally, her daughter-in-law returned to her own room, and Mrs. Eleanor carefully closed her door, sleep completely gone. The next morning, Julia arrived before breakfast as usual. Mrs. Eleanor found her in the kitchen and, after making sure they were alone, told her about the episode from the previous night. "She was in the hallway looking at your room, Julia. She had something in her hand." The young woman frowned, concerned. "Mrs. Eleanor, I think it's time we talk to Robert. This is getting dangerous." "But how to convince him? Isabella might deny everything, say I'm delirious." "That's why I've been documenting everything. The photos of the staples, the dates, times. And what's more, I've recorded some conversations." "You've recorded conversations?" Julia nodded, a little embarrassed. "I know it's not right to do that without consent, but when I realized what was happening, I started leaving my phone recording when I left the rooms. I captured some interesting things." The young woman took out her phone and played it. It was an audio recording where Isabella's voice could be clearly heard talking on the phone with someone. "No, Mum, she's still quite firm. I thought she'd be more confused by now." Isabella's voice sounded cold, mechanical. "But I'll keep going. Eventually she'll start showing signs. Then we convince Robert to sell her to a clinic. With the house money, we can finally get out of this hole and buy something decent in Kensington." Mrs. Eleanor felt her legs weaken. Hearing that said aloud, with such coldness and calculation, was worse than she had imagined. Isabella not only wanted the house, but was willing to destroy her mother-in-law's mental and physical health to get it. "There's more," Julia said, fast-forwarding the recording. "This one is from yesterday." This time, it was a conversation between Isabella and a woman Mrs. Eleanor didn't recognize. The voices were muffled, but still comprehensible. "Are you sure these staples don't leave a permanent mark?" Isabella asked. "I'm sure after they're removed it heals in a few days," the other voice replied. "And no one will think to look for that. They'll just think it's senility." "Perfect. How much do I owe you for another packet?" Mrs. Eleanor couldn't listen anymore. She put her hand to her mouth, fighting a wave of nausea. Julia turned off the audio and held the elderly woman's hands firmly. "Mrs. Eleanor, I know it's very difficult to hear this, but now we have concrete proof. We can show Robert." Before Mrs. Eleanor could reply, they heard the front door open. Isabella had gone shopping, but apparently returned earlier. The two women exchanged glances, and Julia quickly put her phone in her pocket. Isabella entered the kitchen carrying some shopping bags. Her gaze immediately went to the two, and Mrs. Eleanor noticed a spark of suspicion in her daughter-in-law's eyes. "Talking about what?" Isabella asked in a casual tone, but her eyes betrayed her curiosity. "About recipes," Julia replied promptly. "Mrs. Eleanor was teaching me how to make her cornmeal cake." "Ah, how interesting." Isabella placed the bags on the counter. "Julia, I need to speak with you for a moment. In private." Mrs. Eleanor felt panic rise. She didn't want to leave Julia alone with Isabella, but she had no valid reason to stop it. Julia gave her a reassuring look and followed Isabella into the living room. Mrs. Eleanor stayed in the kitchen, her ears attentive, but the voices of the two women were just an indistinct murmur. The minutes dragged on like hours, until Julia returned, alone, with a controlled expression but alert eyes. "What did she want?" Mrs. Eleanor whispered, as soon as she was sure Isabella had gone upstairs. "She asked me if you've been saying strange things, if you've been complaining of pains or mental confusion. She said she's worried about you, that perhaps it's time to seek a specialist." "A specialist?" Mrs. Eleanor repeated, the meaning of the words becoming clear. "She wants to have me institutionalized. We won't let that happen, but we need to act fast. What time does Robert get home today?" "Around 6, as always." Julia looked at the clock. It was 2 in the afternoon. We have 4 hours to prepare. I'll organize all the evidence I have, the photos, the recordings. When he arrives, you need to tell him everything. I don't know if I can, Julia. What if he doesn't believe me? What if he takes her side? The young woman held Mrs. Eleanor's face with both hands, looking directly into her eyes. He will believe you because he is your son, and he loves you, and because we will have proof that cannot be denied. You are strong, Mrs. Eleanor. You have survived so many things in life. You will survive this too. Throughout the afternoon, Julia and Mrs. Eleanor meticulously organized all the evidence. The 4 staples were placed in a transparent plastic bag. The photos were printed at a nearby stationery shop by Julia. The audio recordings were saved in 3 different places to ensure they wouldn't be lost. Isabella spent the afternoon in her room, making occasional calls and only coming out to get water from the kitchen. Each time she appeared, she cast investigative glances at Mrs. Eleanor and Julia, as if sensing that something was happening beyond her control. When the clock struck 5:30, Mrs. Eleanor began to prepare dinner, her hands trembling slightly as she peeled potatoes. Julia worked by her side, offering silent support with her presence. At 6 o'clock sharp, they heard Robert's van park in front of the house, the sound of the door opening, his familiar footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath, preparing for one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Robert entered the kitchen with his usual smile, but soon noticed the tension in the air. "Is everything all right?" he asked, looking from his mother to Julia and back. "My son," Mrs. Eleanor began, her voice firm despite her fear, "I need to talk to you about something very serious, and I need you to listen to me until the end before saying anything." Robert pulled up a chair and sat at the kitchen table, his face showing genuine concern. Julia made a move to leave to give the family privacy, but Mrs. Eleanor asked her to stay. "She's part of this too, my son. She needs to be here." Robert nodded, confused but trusting. Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to tell him everything, from the inexplicable pains in her head to the discovery of the metal staples. With each revelation, she saw her son's face change, passing from confusion to disbelief and finally to horror. "Mum, that can't be right. Isabella would never do something like that. There must be an explanation. I know it's hard to believe, Robert. I didn't want to believe it at first either. But look at this." Julia placed the plastic bag with the staples on the table. Robert took the bag with trembling hands, examining the small pieces of rusty metal. "These could have come from anywhere, from some accident you don't remember, Mum. 4 staples, Robert. All buried in my scalp, all hidden under my hair. What kind of accident would do that?" Julia then showed the photos she had taken, enlargements that clearly showed the inflamed marks where the staples had been embedded. She also showed photos taken after removal, showing the tiny holes that were beginning to heal. Robert ran his hands over his face, the weight of the evidence beginning to affect him. But there was still resistance in his eyes, the understandable desire not to believe that his wife could be capable of such cruelty. "There's more, my son," Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "Julia, play the recordings." The young woman took out her phone and played the audio recordings. Robert listened in silence, his face growing paler and paler. When it reached the part where Isabella discussed institutionalizing his mother and selling the house, he closed his eyes tightly, as if to block out the reality. "Stop," he pleaded in a hoarse voice. "Stop, please." Julia paused the recording. The silence that settled in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Robert stood up abruptly, walking to the window and turning his back to the 2 women. His shoulders trembled, and Mrs. Eleanor realized that her son was crying silently. "It all makes sense now," he finally said, his voice choked. "The changes in her after we got married, the insistence on moving house, the conversations she has with her mother about money, I didn't want to see because I was blinded by passion." Mrs. Eleanor stood up and went to her son, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You are not to blame, my son. Love makes us trust, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I let her do this to you." Robert turned, tears streaming freely down his face. "I brought this woman into our house, and she hurt you, Mum." Mrs. Eleanor hugged her son, feeling her own tears begin to fall. For long minutes they remained like that, mother and son, united in pain and the discovery of a profound betrayal. "What are we going to do now?" Robert asked when they finally separated. Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Isabella appeared at the kitchen entrance, already dressed to go out, perfect makeup and a shoulder bag. "Robert, we'll have to reschedule our dinner tonight." She stopped when she saw the scene, 3 people with red eyes looking at her. What happened here? Robert took a step forward, placing himself between his mother and his wife. "Isabella, I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to be honest." "Of course, darling." "What questions?" "Have you been touching my mother's hair lately?" Isabella hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough to betray her guilt. "Sometimes I comb her hair, yes." "Why? Is she complaining about something?" "How do you explain this?" Robert picked up the plastic bag with the staples and showed it to her. Color drained from Isabella's face. "What is that?" "They are metal staples that were removed from my mother's head, from her scalp, Isabella, buried in her skin." "I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe she hurt herself and doesn't remember. You know how it is, old age." "Don't try to blame her age." Robert's voice rose for the first time. "I heard the recordings, Isabella. I heard you talking about institutionalizing her, about selling this house." Isabella's face changed completely. The expression of surprise and innocence gave way to something colder, more calculated. She looked at Julia with pure hatred. "It was you, wasn't it, you gold digger? You came here to infiltrate the family, to turn everyone against me." "I came here to work," Julia replied calmly, "but I couldn't stand by and watch what you were doing to Mrs. Eleanor. You have no proof of anything. Recordings can be edited, manipulated, and these staples, who's to say you didn't put them there yourself to incriminate me?" "Isabella," Mrs. Eleanor spoke, her voice surprisingly firm, "you were filmed by the neighbor's security camera last night when you came to comb my hair. Julia checked it today. It was a bluff, there was no camera, but it worked." Isabella's face contorted into an expression of rage and frustration. "You don't deserve this house," she finally exploded. "Living in this run-down neighborhood with these old furniture pieces, these ridiculous clothes. Robert deserves better, and so do I. But you're a leech, clinging to him, not letting us live our lives." "So it's true," Robert said, his voice low but laden with disappointment. "You really did this to her. And I'd do it again. That old woman is getting in the way of our plans. We could be living in Kensington in a modern apartment with a real life, but no, we have to stay here in this miserable place because you don't have the courage to put your mother in a suitable place for her age." "A suitable place?" Robert took a step forward, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "You're talking about institutionalizing my mother, a perfectly sane woman just to steal her house? It's not stealing if it's family. And I'm your wife, Robert. You should be on my side." "I'm on the side of what's right, Isabella. And that's certainly not you." Isabella looked around, realizing she had completely lost control of the situation. Her expression went through several rapid changes, from anger to despair, from arrogance to fear. "Robert, darling," she tried one last time, softening her voice, "I just wanted the best for us, for our future family. We can't raise children in this place." "We're not raising any children," Robert replied firmly. "This marriage is over, Isabella. I want you to pack your things and leave this house." "You can't kick me out like this." "Yes, I can. This house belongs to my mother, and I will not allow you to continue under the same roof as her after what you've done." Isabella looked at Mrs. Eleanor with hatred, then at Julia with contempt, and finally at Robert with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You'll regret this, Robert. When you're old and alone in this old house, you'll remember you had a chance to have a better life with me. The only thing I'll regret is not seeing your true face before I married you." Isabella grabbed her purse violently and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "You haven't heard the last of me," she threatened, and slammed the door shut. The silence that followed was disturbed only by Mrs. Eleanor's suppressed sobs. Robert went to her and hugged her again. "I'm sorry, Mum. I'm sorry I didn't see it before, for not protecting you." "You didn't know, my son. None of us knew what she was capable of." "Julia, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Robert, I think you should consult a lawyer, and perhaps it would be good to make a formal report of what happened." The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. Robert sought a lawyer specializing in family law, who advised him on divorce procedures and how to protect himself against possible retaliation from Isabella. The recordings and physical evidence of the Staples were formally documented and kept safe. Isabella, for her part, did not carry out her threat to cause problems. On the contrary, when confronted with the possibility of the evidence becoming public, and especially with Robert's lawyer's suggestion of possible legal action for elder abuse, she quickly signed the divorce papers. She took her belongings one Friday afternoon, accompanied by her mother, without speaking a single word to Mrs. Eleanor or Robert. Mrs. Eleanor watched from the window as Isabella carried the last boxes to the car. She felt a mixture of relief and sadness, not for her daughter-in-law's departure, but for the suffering she saw in her son. Robert tried to hide it, but she knew every expression on that face she loved so much. He was hurt, not only by the betrayal, but by the breach of trust in something he had believed to be true love. "Mum," Robert said, appearing beside her at the window, "everything will be all right. We'll be all right. I know, my son. I have you, and that's all I need." In the following months, the house gradually regained its old welcoming atmosphere. Robert initially buried himself in work, using the car repair shop as a refuge to process his emotions. But little by little, he began to come home earlier, to spend more time with his mother, to recover those moments of conversation and laughter that had been lost during his marriage. Julia continued to work in the house, but her role had evolved far beyond that of a domestic helper. She had become part of the family, a constant and comforting presence for both Mrs. Eleanor and Robert. It was she who prepared Sunday breakfast, who suggested trips to Kew Gardens or the London Eye, who slowly brought new life to that house. Mrs. Eleanor noticed, with a mother's keen insight, that something was blossoming between Robert and Julia. It started with glances that lasted a second longer than necessary, conversations that extended through the kitchen even after she had retired to her room, shared laughter over jokes only the two of them understood. But Robert was hesitant. One night, sitting on the porch with his mother, he finally verbalized his concerns. "Mum, I don't know if I'm ready to trust someone again. What if I'm wrong about the person another time?" Mrs. Eleanor lovingly took her son's hand. "My son, Julia, is not Isabella. You saw her character when she could have simply ignored what she was seeing and continued to receive her salary. But she chose to do what was right, even risking her job. I know that in my head, Mum, but my heart is still afraid. Fear is part of it, Robert, but it can't paralyze you forever. Life goes on, and you deserve to be happy." Robert smiled, squeezing his mother's hand. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise, you just took a while to notice," she replied with a mischievous smile. It was Julia who took the first definitive step. On a Saturday afternoon, 3 months after Isabella's departure, she arrived with ingredients to make a hearty stew. "Mrs. Eleanor, let me make lunch today. I want to prepare something special." Throughout the morning, the kitchen filled with the delicious aromas of black beans slowly cooking with meats, of sautéed greens, of toasted farofa. Robert appeared, attracted by the smell, offering to help. Mrs. Eleanor, watching the two working side by side, laughing when flour escaped the pan, stealing pieces of sausage when the other wasn't looking, felt her heart warm. After lunch, Julia suggested a walk around the neighborhood. Mrs. Eleanor claimed tiredness, encouraging Robert and Julia to go alone. They left together, and Mrs. Eleanor stayed on the porch, watching them go down the Notting Hill slope side by side. When they returned hours later, they were holding hands. "Mum," Robert began, entering the living room where Mrs. Eleanor pretended to read a magazine, "Julia and I talked a lot today, and well, I would like your blessing for us to start a serious relationship." Mrs. Eleanor looked from one to the other, seeing the happiness in both their eyes, the way they positioned themselves close to each other, the genuine connection they had built. "Robert, you don't need my blessing, but you have it with all my heart." Julia is a wonderful young woman, and seeing you two happy is all I could ever want." Julia let go of Robert's hand and went to hug Mrs. Eleanor. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for welcoming me into this family. I am the one who thanks you, my dear. You saved my life and saved my... More importantly, you saved the unity of my family." The relationship between Robert and Julia blossomed naturally. There was no rush, no pressure. They built something solid, based on mutual trust, respect, and a genuine affection that grew every day. Mrs. Eleanor watched all this with satisfaction, but a concern still lingered. One morning during breakfast, she brought up the subject. "Julia, I've been thinking about something. You've been living in that small back room for months, working here every day. That's not right. Mrs. Eleanor, I like being here, and the room is comfortable. It's not about that, my dear. It's about you having your own life too. You shouldn't be here as an employee. You are part of this family now." Robert immediately agreed. "Mum is right, Julia. I don't want you to feel obligated to work here. You can stay, live with us as family, not as an employee." Julia was silent for a moment, processing the offer. "But I need to contribute somehow. I don't feel comfortable just living here without doing anything." It was Mrs. Eleanor who had the idea. "What if we transform part of the house into a small sewing studio? I could teach you my craft. We could take orders. It would be our business for the three of us." The idea was met with enthusiasm. In the following weeks, the old guest room was transformed into a cozy studio. Mrs. Eleanor's old sewing machine was joined by a more modern one that Robert bought second-hand. Colorful fabrics began to occupy shelves, mannequins appeared in the corners, and the space came alive. Julia proved to be a dedicated student. Her young, agile hands quickly mastered the techniques Mrs. Eleanor patiently taught. Soon they were taking small jobs, clothing alterations, making simple pieces. The money they earned was modest, but it meant independence and purpose for both of them. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the studio, Julia asked something that had been on her mind for a long time. "Mrs. Eleanor, how do you manage not to be angry about what Isabella did?" The elderly woman paused her sewing, thinking carefully before answering. "Anger wouldn't change what happened, my dear. And holding on to anger would only poison my own heart. Isabella made bad choices, and she will have to live with the consequences, but I choose to live with peace and gratitude for what I have now." "You are incredible, you know that?" Mrs. Eleanor smiled, returning to her sewing. "I'm just an old woman who learned that life is too short to waste with resentment." One evening, Robert came home with a special sparkle in his eyes. He gathered his mother and Julia in the living room and announced that the workshop was doing very well, that he had secured a large contract with a transport company, and that he finally felt financially stable again. "And there's one more thing," he said, kneeling before Julia. The young woman put her hands to her mouth, already knowing what was coming next. "Julia, since the day you arrived here, you've brought light to this house. You saved my mother, you saved our family, and without realizing it, you saved my heart too. I know it hasn't been that long since the divorce, but I am absolutely certain of my feelings. Will you marry me?" Robert opened a small velvet box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring with a blue stone that sparkled under the living room light. Julia was crying, tears streaming freely down her face. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes, Robert." He placed the ring on her finger and stood up to kiss her, while Mrs. Eleanor applauded emotionally from her armchair. "My children, what joy! What immense joy!" The three hugged, forming a circle of affection and gratitude. Mrs. Eleanor felt that finally, after so many trials, peace had come to stay in her home. Preparations for the wedding began immediately. Julia and Robert wanted something simple and intimate, a celebration with close friends and neighbors from the district. No excessive luxury or ostentation, just genuine love and people who truly mattered. Mrs. Eleanor insisted on sewing Julia's wedding dress. "My dear, this will be my gift to you, a dress made with all the love I have in my heart." Together, they chose a delicate lace fabric in an ivory shade. Mrs. Eleanor worked tirelessly in her studio, each stitch made with care and affection. Julia came to try on the dress at each stage, and when it was finally ready, it was a masterpiece of elegant simplicity. When Julia tried on the complete dress for the first time, Mrs. Eleanor couldn't hold back her tears. You look beautiful, my dear, so beautiful. It's perfect, Mrs. Eleanor. It's more than I could have ever dreamed of. As the preparations continued, an unexpected event brought one last complication. One afternoon, the doorbell rang, and when Mrs. Eleanor answered, she found Isabella standing at the door. The ex-daughter-in-law looked different. Her hair, always impeccably styled, was simpler. Her clothes, once always designer, were casual. But the most notable change was in her eyes. There was something Mrs. Eleanor had never seen before. Shame. Mrs. Eleanor, Isabella began, her voice hesitant, I know I have no right to be here. I know I don't even deserve for you to open the door for me. But I needed to come. I needed to apologize. Mrs. Eleanor remained silent, processing the situation. Robert appeared behind her, his expression immediately hardening when he saw who was there. What do you want, Isabella? Isabella looked at her ex-husband, and Mrs. Eleanor saw tears in the young woman's eyes. I want to ask for forgiveness, for what I did, for the horrible person I was. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say that I am deeply sorry. Robert took a step forward, placing himself in front of Mrs. Eleanor in a protective gesture. You almost had my mother institutionalized, Isabella. You caused her physical pain. You manipulated and lied. Why should we believe your repentance is genuine? Because I lost everything, Isabella replied, her voice breaking. I lost my family, my friends. My own mother barely speaks to me after she found out what I did. I'm in therapy trying to understand why I was capable of doing something so cruel, and I wanted you to know that. Mrs. Eleanor felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of an understanding. She placed her hand on Robert's shoulder, signaling that she wanted to speak. Isabella, I don't know if I will ever be able to completely forgive what you did, but I thank you for coming here, for having the courage to admit your mistakes. That's already a start. I don't expect forgiveness, Mrs. Eleanor. I just wanted you to know that you didn't do anything wrong. The fault was all mine, my greed, my lack of character. You are a beautiful family, and I was too foolish to value that. Robert remained silent, clearly struggling with his emotions. Finally, he nodded. Isabella, I hope you find your way and become a better person. But I cannot have you in my life. I understand. And Robert, I heard you're getting married again. I truly hope you're very happy. With those words, Isabella turned and left, descending the Notting Hill steps for the last time. Mrs. Eleanor and Robert stood at the door, watching her depart. Are you all right, Mum? I am, my son. In fact, I feel at peace. She needs help, and it seems she's finally seeking it. Robert hugged his mother. You have a very big heart, you know. I learned from my own mother that holding grudges only hurts us more. Isabella will have to live with what she did. Our part is to move forward. The wedding day arrived on a sunny Saturday morning. The ceremony would be in the small local church, followed by a reception at the house, which had been decorated with flowers gathered by neighbors. Mrs. Eleanor helped Julia get ready. The lace dress fit perfectly, enhancing the young woman's natural beauty. In her hair, a simple wreath of white flowers. Are you nervous, my dear? A little. But it's a good kind of nervous. No? Of happiness. Mrs. Eleanor held Julia's hands. I wanted to say something. When you arrived here that morning, I never imagined that I was receiving not only my salvation, but also a daughter. Because that's what you are to me now, Julia. The daughter I never had. Julia hugged Mrs. Eleanor, both crying tears of joy, and you are the mother I always dreamed of having. The ceremony was simple and moving. Robert, wearing a grey suit that had belonged to his father and that Mrs. Eleanor had perfectly tailored, waited at the altar with eyes shining with happiness. When Julia entered the church, accompanied by Mrs. Eleanor, a murmur of admiration went through the attendees. The priest, an elderly man who had known the family for decades, conducted the ceremony with warm simplicity. His words about love, trust, and family resonated deeply with everyone present, especially Robert and Julia, who knew better than anyone the value of these things. Robert and Julia, you found each other in unusual circumstances, but you built something true and solid. May this love continue to grow and bless not only the two of you, but everyone around you. when Robert said his vows. His voice was firm and full of emotion. "Julia, you taught me that it's possible to trust again, to love again. I promise to take care of you, respect you, and build a beautiful life by your side." Julia, in turn, held Robert's hands firmly. "Robert, you and Mrs. Eleanor gave me a family. I promise to honor that gift every day of my life." The reception that followed was joyful and relaxed. Mrs. Eleanor's house filled with music, laughter, and the delicious aroma of food prepared by the neighbors. Every room overflowed with life and happiness, a striking contrast to the dark days they had lived months before. Mrs. Eleanor, seated in her favorite armchair, observed everything with a smile on her face. Her white hair sparkled under the decorative lights, and her expression was one of pure contentment. The pains in her head were now just a distant memory, as was the loneliness she had felt. A year had passed since Robert and Julia's wedding. The Notting Hill house was more alive than ever, full of colours, laughter, and the constant sound of the sewing machine coming from the studio that now occupied 2 rooms. Mrs. Eleanor and Julia's business had prospered beyond their initial expectations. What started as small clothing alterations had transformed into a respected studio in the neighborhood, known for the quality of its work and the care with which each piece was made. They had even hired an assistant, a young woman named Beatrice, who was learning the craft with the same enthusiasm Julia had shown a year earlier. Mrs. Eleanor, at 77 years old, felt younger and more vigorous than she had in a long time. The pains in her head were just a distant memory, a dark period that she sometimes still had difficulty believing had actually happened. But the scars, though tiny and almost invisible, were still there as proof that it had all been real. On a Sunday morning, the family was gathered for the traditional breakfast they had resumed. The table was laden with cheese bread, cakes, fresh fruit, and the filtered coffee that Mrs. Eleanor insisted on making the old-fashioned way. "Mum, Julia," Robert began, a mischievous smile on his lips. "We have some news to share." Julia held her husband's hand, her eyes shining with happiness. "We're having a baby. I'm 2 months pregnant." Mrs. Eleanor let her coffee cup fall onto the table, the dark liquid spilling, but she didn't even notice. She brought her hands to her chest, feeling her heart race with pure joy. "A baby? I'm going to be a grandmother." "Yes, Mum, you're going to be a grandmother." Mrs. Eleanor got up from her chair so quickly she almost knocked it over, circling the table to hug them both. "What joy! What immense joy! I can't believe it!" The 3 hugged, crying and laughing at the same time. After the embrace, Mrs. Eleanor held Julia's face with both hands. "My dear, what a wonderful gift you're giving us." "The baby will have the best grandmother in the world," Julia said, emotional. In the following weeks, the house filled with conversations about the baby that was to come. Robert began to prepare the old back room where Julia had lived when she first arrived at the house, transforming it into a nursery. Mrs. Eleanor was already planning the clothes she would sew, imagining tiny rompers and delicate dresses. One afternoon, while working together in the studio, Julia brought up a subject she had been thinking about for some time. "Mrs. Eleanor, Robert and I talked, and we want you to know that this house will always be yours. We will never ask you to sell it or make any changes you don't want." Mrs. Eleanor stopped sewing and looked at her daughter-in-law with tenderness. "My dear, I know that. You two have given me back not only the security of having my home, but the joy of having a real family. And when the baby is born, we want you to help raise him or her, to teach my son or daughter everything you taught me. That would be the greatest honor of my life." The months of pregnancy passed at a quiet and happy pace. Julia's belly grew, and with it grew the expectation of the whole family. Robert became even more attentive, always making sure his wife didn't exert herself too much. Mrs. Eleanor took on more responsibilities in the studio, working with Beatrice so that Julia could rest more. One evening, a few days before the due date, Robert, Julia, and Mrs. Eleanor were sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze that swept up the Notting Hill slope. "You know, Mrs. Eleanor," Julia said, "I sometimes think about how my life has changed since I came here. If someone had told me a year ago that I would be married to Robert, expecting a baby, being part of this wonderful family, I would never have believed it." Mrs. Eleanor held her daughter-in-law's hand. "Destiny works in mysterious ways, my dear. You came here to save me, but you ended up saving all of us." Robert agreed, putting his arm around Julia's shoulders. "If it weren't for you, I'd still be blind, living in a toxic relationship, and my mother would be suffering in silence. I just did what any decent person would do," Julia replied modestly. "No, my dear," Mrs. Eleanor corrected. "Many people would have ignored it, would have chosen not to get involved. You were brave, you were kind, and for that, you deserve all the happiness you are experiencing now." The baby was born on a rainy April morning, a beautiful girl with dark eyes like her father's and hair that promised to be curly like her mother's. They named her Eleanor, in honor of the grandmother who had fought so much and won. When Mrs. Eleanor held her granddaughter for the first time, she felt such intense love that she thought her heart would explode. Little Eleanor opened her eyes and seemed to look directly at her grandmother, and in that moment, Mrs. Eleanor knew that everything she had been through, all the pain, all the suffering, had been worth it to get to that point. "Welcome to the world, my little granddaughter," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Your grandmother will teach you everything about strength, about love, about never giving up." Robert and Julia watched the scene, holding hands, their hearts full of gratitude. They had built something beautiful from that terrible situation. They had transformed pain into love, fear into hope. A few months later, on a sunny Sunday, the Notting Hill house was celebrating again. It was little Eleanor's christening, and the entire neighborhood had been invited. The house was decorated with white and gold flowers and balloons, the table laden with food prepared by all the family's friends. Mrs. Eleanor, now 78, circulated through the party with her granddaughter in her arms, proudly introducing her to each visitor. Little Eleanor, at 3 months old, gurgled happily in her grandmother's arms, completely oblivious to how much her existence meant to that family. Julia approached, taking some photos with her phone. "Mrs. Eleanor, would you like me to take Eleanor so you can rest?" "Not at all, my dear. Spending the whole day with my granddaughter isn't tiring. It's pure joy." Robert joined them, hugging his wife and kissing his daughter's head. "Looking at you three," he said, "I see everything that truly matters in this life. Family, true love, and the courage to protect those we love." Mrs. Eleanor looked at her son and her daughter-in-law, then at her little granddaughter in her arms, and finally at the house around them, full of beloved people, laughter, life. Everything she had fought for, everything she had preserved, was there, alive and vibrant. "You know, my children," she said, "I've lived a lot in this life. I've seen difficult times, faced battles no one imagined. But I learned that life always gives us chances to start over, to find joy even after the deepest pain. And looking at you now, at my little granddaughter, at everything we've built together, I know that every day of struggle was worth it." Robert hugged his mother and daughter together, Julia, joining the family embrace. "And all thanks to you, Mum. Your strength inspired us all. No, my son, it was thanks to us. Because family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands by us in the most difficult moments, who protects us, who loves us unconditionally." And so, on that sunny Sunday afternoon in Notting Hill, as the celebration continued around them, the family remained united, celebrating not only the christening of a new life, but the very life they had learned to value and protect. The story of Mrs. Eleanor, Robert and Julia was a story of overcoming adversity, of love that conquers hardship, of how kindness can transform the destiny of an entire family. And as little Eleanor grew up hearing this story, she would learn that true strength is not in never falling, but in always getting up, in never losing faith in human kindness, and in always protecting those we love. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Eleanor, Robert and Julia has touched your hearts. This narrative reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when pain seems unbearable and betrayal comes from where we least expect it, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. Julia's courage to do what was right, Mrs. Eleanor's strength not to give up, and Robert's love in choosing to stand by the truth teach us valuable lessons about family, loyalty, and the importance of protecting our loved ones. If this story moved you as much as it moved us in telling it, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of the stories we prepare for you. Leave a like on this video and share your reflections on Mrs. Eleanor's journey in the comments. Your words are important to us and to our entire community. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life, the challenges of family, and the beauty of true love. Stay with us for more narratives that will make you laugh, cry, and reflect. Until the next story, and always remember, the family that protects each other is the family that stays united forever.